Strong men aren't born. They are formed out of the struggles and the storms that they can overcome. My conversation today is with Bill Harris. Bill Harris is a Navy veteran of over 2 decades, and Bill's going to share how spending half of his career in combat situations as a Navy medic in some of the most dangerous territories in our planet shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a strong, powerful man. It's probably not what you expect. Bill says that a guy who's willing to be the most vulnerable, the most honest, and the most forthcoming about who he is and where he is in relation to what's going on tends to be the most powerful man in the room. I love that quote from Bill. You are going to get so much out of this conversation. And this conversation is going to prove to you that whatever your story, your past does not dictate your future. Learn from Bill's story, relate to it, be inspired, and follow his lead. This 2023, it's time to unleash a stronger, more powerful you. My conversation with Bill Harris starts right now. Hello, my friend. Welcome to this episode of the Dad's Making a Difference podcast. My name is Cam Hall. I'm your host and founder of the Dad's Making a Difference Mastermind. And I'm grateful for you. I'm glad that you're here today. Thank you for listening. If this is the first time that you are listening to our podcast, welcome. Glad that you're here. And if you are returning, hey, I appreciate you. I appreciate you liking and subscribing and sharing these episodes. And I'm going to guarantee that today you will not be disappointed. For my guest today is Bill Harris. Bill is a Navy veteran of over 2 decades. Bill served multiple combat missions in the Middle East. He served 8 years alongside the U.S. Marines and 7 years as the senior assault squadron medic at Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He's worked alongside the Navy SEALs and has had some incredible, traumatic, intense, amazing experiences in his career. And it would have been really easy for me to get on this episode today and in this conversation and prep for this interview just to ask Bill to tell us stories, to tell us stories of what he's been through, to tell us stories about his past and how he got to where he is today, and to really dive into some of those combat experiences. But there's more to our conversation today, because when Bill left his military service, Bill suffered from severe bouts of PTSD and crippling anxiety. So today, Bill's passion is helping veterans, first responders, and men who have had traumatic pasts at overcoming and triumphing and thriving in their life. Bill is the founder of the Turn 2 Project and hosts Man Camp, where he brings men together to overcome and build community. Bill is a father of 3 amazing boys and husband of over 31 years. He's worked with corporate partners, Fortune 500 companies, military agencies, universities, the CIA, and the list goes on and on. I'm excited for you to dive into this conversation about becoming a powerful, stronger man. And it's not going to be what you would expect from an ex-Navy medic who's worked alongside the Navy SEALs in 10 years of combat. He is an amazing guy. I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. So let's get to it. Here is my conversation with Bill Harris. Bill Harris, good to see you, brother. Welcome to the Dad's Making a Difference podcast. Good to talk to you today.
Man, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Man, since we were able to connect, a week or so ago, I've been looking forward to this, as I often do with the guys who come on. And I was like, man, here's another rock solid man just looking to make an impact and make a difference in the lives of others. And I think a good place to start, Bill, would be, I shared a little bit in the intro about you, but to start with your story, because your story isn't like a lot of stories, isn't like the story of a lot of men who come on here, isn't like a lot of the men that I've met, for sure. So why don't you tell us a little about who you are, how you grew up, and then how life led you into maybe military service and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. And it's interesting you say that, because I agree and disagree with that statement. I think I think my story may have a lot of uniqueness, but I think my story is a lot like everyone else's,
Okay. Okay.
a lot of struggle, a lot of learning, and a lot of, sort of what you're dedicated to, just trying to be better, trying to be better than a former version of myself. But, that said, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up a son of a New York City firefighter. Um, typical childhood. Sports, was probably was all I cared about. I wasn't a very good student. I wasn't. I was the oldest of three siblings, and all I wanted to do is run around the street, play wiffle ball and football and hockey, and whatever else, basketball, whatever we get our hands on. We probably, for me, when I think about the significant or impactful things in my life, my senior year of high school, my dad was injured and retired from fire service, and we moved to Pennsylvania. And looking back, that had a pretty significant impact, because I went from, living in Brooklyn, New York, being a city kid, to living, in the Pocono Mountains, in the country, in the woods, where there were deer, and kids on the school bus were dipping tobacco. And I literally felt like I landed on another planet. And it was interesting, because a lot of the things that frightened me about living there, now as an adult, are things that I'm really endeared to, right? Like I'm all about guns and hunting and woods and quiet and stuff, all the things that I didn't understand, frankly, and I had never been exposed to.
The quiet, for sure.
Yeah. And so I went to college up there. I wasn't very good at college up there. I played a little bit of baseball. I did, probably more drinking of beer and hanging out than I did studying. So my college career ended pretty abruptly. And I was blessed enough to have met a woman that, fast forward 35 years later, we're still together. She's blessed me with three boys. And we, you mentioned my military service. We, unlike most of my counterparts, most of my friends, we joined the Navy together. Right.
Oh,
Most of the guys and gals I served with, they sort of were young and came in service, and then, gathered a spouse along the way. But, this is something that we had decided to do. And so we, I went away for a little bit, did the boot camp thing. And then we spent most of my military career. I joined the Navy. I did 21 years of active duty. Let me rephrase that, 21 years of active duty. And almost all of that, we were kind of home based in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Okay.
So was driving distance from her family and my family in Pennsylvania. And in fact, most of them migrated down. Once grandbabies show up, grandparents tend to follow pretty quickly. I did a little bit of overseas time. I spent some time in Iceland. I was fortunate to have been what's called a hospital corpsman in the Navy, and that's essentially a combat medic. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. My dad had spent a few years in the Navy, so he was helpful in helping me navigate me through some of that. And it turned out to be, one of the biggest blessings in my life. It clearly, now looking back retrospectively, it's absolutely one of the things God put me on this earth to do. You know what I mean? I was called to service, and I was called to do that. And I'm still a medic. I'm still an active medic. Most of my time now is spent teaching. So, another nicety about the Navy is there's a lot of ability to see and do different things and work in different areas. And being in medicine gave me a little more leverage to do that. So I was really blessed to have seen a little bit of all the different parts of the Navy. I spent about eight of my years on the Marine Corps side, in a whole different service, which I have, the Marine Corps is near and dear to my heart. I spent a little bit of time in an aviation squadron with fighter pilots. I spent 3 years on board a ship. I tell people all the time I'm on the best ship in the Navy right now, citizenship. And then the back portion of my career, the last 7, almost 8 years, I spent with SEAL teams. I spent, at a special mission unit, a Tier 1 Command, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, a very, very elite team. I was very privileged to even had an opportunity to have screened and had the opportunity to go work there. And, I'm still growing as an adult, and I'm still sort of reflecting on my time there. And there's still things I'm learning, just having the opportunity to work around other men and women who really are the top 1% of their field. So,
yeah, incredible.
And in that back end, a whole lot of trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, a whole lot of combat. My career was split dead in half. The first 10 years of it were peacetime military. And I sort of grew up thinking that my whole career would be just training for a job I'd never really get to do. And then I was mistaken. We've had 18 plus years of sustained combat. And then the back half of it was the exact opposite. You know what I mean? It was far less time at home and far more time, in every climb and place, chasing down, people who intend to take away our freedoms and do us harm.
Yeah. Wow. Can we go back for a moment? I have a question about when you decided to join the Navy and you said you and your wife both decided. I'm interested in, my wife and I have conversations about date night and maybe starting a business together, but starting and at that time, different point in your life, of course. But what does that conversation look like with you and her to say, yeah, let's join the military. Let's join the Navy together?
Yeah. Well, people say all the time, it's one of the more common things you'll hear people say is thank you for your service. And it tends to make veterans very uncomfortable because we're not sure how to respond to that. Yeah. And I've gotten a little more comfortable with that. And now my standard response is thanks for your support. I don't, and the reason that question particularly made me feel uncomfortable because it wasn't obviously. Now looking at it, I felt called to serve. I felt as though I wanted to be tethered to something bigger. I felt as though there was something else out there for me. But in truth and in fairness, another significant component of it was I was a young guy without a lot of marketable skills who had washed out of college. And at that point, I had a wife and a stepson. My wife had a son, so I had responsibilities. And so for me, it was intriguing. I had some family history of folks who had served. And so, as much as I want to say, there are a lot of guys who will come on now and, that are younger than me and say, hey, 9/11 happened and the bell rang and I answered the call. Yeah. You know what I mean? So for me, I did feel a call to service, but I also, I knew it would be a good way to put food on the table and to get a marketable skill moving forward. I didn't think that we'd sign up for 20 plus years.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question. Did you think that you'd be in it for two plus decades?
No, and I think most people don't. Most people, number one, it's a very foreign concept. Unless you have somebody really close to you. Obviously, my dad served, but that was long before I existed. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to it, and what it really meant. You know what I mean? You'd see it in movies and television, and maybe you had, crazy Uncle Bob or something that had served.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know much about it. You know what I mean? I didn't, and so. I think for a lot of young people, and now having been overseas and been exposed to other cultures where service is mandatory for them,
right?
I think there's a lot of value if you're struggling, or if you're sort of looking for guidance. And the other thing I think that it helps with, if you're the type of person who's struggling with self-discipline, if you don't have a lot of self-discipline, that's a place where someone else will have the discipline for you.
Yeah.
And so for the younger guys or gals that, that do 4 years or so, and then we start having candid conversations about what the rest of their life looks like. When you're in a leadership position, the expectation is to try to hold on to them, especially if they're, if they're a valuable asset, right? We've invested in this person and it behooves us to keep them. But those conversations from my perspective were always, almost from a parenting perspective, asking the young person, hey, listen, did you get what you came for? You know what I mean? Have you gotten the self-discipline? Right. Are you in a place where you can move forward with a plan on your life? And you can generally tell by what their answers are to some of those questions. The ones that say, well, I'm going to go home and I'm going to go work for my uncle and make $97 an hour. And like, okay, like that's your plan. Like, how did you end up here to begin with? If that was that, right. And then you check the other ones. Hey, I'm already enrolled in school, or, hey, I'm already, they're fast tracking. And for them, in fact, I've got a nephew who just got out of the Marine Corps Monday. Okay. Just finished his 5 years. He did, one combat tour, one overseas tour. And when I spoke to him, he's like, yeah, I absolutely got what I came for. Right. I served, I learned a lot about myself, and I'm a semi-grown man now heading home, ready to, and I think that's a different person going home than the 18-year-old that gets in the car and you drop off at a university for the first time. And for the first time, they're sort of on their own, and the hope is that they make it,
Yeah. Can I ask you, you mentioned that your career was split dead half, in peacekeeping time and then in combat. and so in active, I don't want to say active duty, but wrong term, but I'm curious, you were in it for over 20 years. If that first half ended up being the consistency, would you, you're a driven guy who's like, you seem to be a guy who I think about action, about like moving forward, about taking the next step, about continuing to grow. If it continued to be how it was the first 10 years, would you've still been in for 20 plus years?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to answer.
Mm.
I want to say yes, right? Once
Yeah.
9/11 happened, the whole
Yeah.
entire paradigm shifted. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so I was going nowhere at that point. But
Right.
um, the being driven piece, there's an opportunity to stay in and still work toward that, right? Because in
Right.
the beginning, you're driven toward promotions, and that comes with pay raises, and just like if you were in a corporate structure, right? You're driven for the bigger office, you're driven for the next job, you're driven to be that department head or that section leader or whatever that is. So some of that is naturally occurring along
Mm.
that process, and for like the blueprint, the way that the blueprint was set up for me, right around the time when that conflict started, I started to get near the top of as high as I could go from a rank perspective. And for most folks, their perspective on the back end of their career is, okay, let me start investing in myself and setting myself up for my second career. You know
Right.
what I mean? Let me start finishing my degree. Let me start figuring out what are the things I'm going to need to be successful. Because for most of us, our retirement is not that, it's retirement's the wrong word for it. You're just no longer in service. I can't, provide for my family on my retirement alone. And that's okay. Because that's the arrangement that I made ahead of time. So I thought that back half would be, hey, I'm going to knock out my degree and I'm going to, set myself up and figure out where I'll end up next. And it didn't quite turn out that way.
Yeah. And you mentioned now you're passionate about teaching. You're passionate about teaching others. And you alluded to connecting with, these young service members who are maybe coming in or out the first, 5 years of their career. But those who teach, what I've learned, and coming from an educational perspective, those who teach and teach well are those who've learned along the way to stand on top of their failures and their mistakes and not be buried by them. What did your time in the military, in the Navy, teach you about yourself that you're now eager to share with others?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I think for me, there's two answers. The first answer is when I first started teaching, I was teaching medicine, right? And a lot of the medicine and how we take care of someone that's injured or someone that's shot or blown up, that has changed exponentially over the last 20 years. And 20 years of combat will improve things. It's an unfortunate and costly way for process improvement, but so I think in the beginning, what I was teaching were the mistakes that I made, some of the ways I was trained, some of the things that I went and tried to implement that didn't work. Mm-hmm. And immediately everybody had the same conclusion, like, wow, this isn't the best way to do business. So I've got to share this. I owe this to other people who are going to run into the same problems I ran into. The second portion of that question is sort of my post-military struggle. You know what I mean? That's sort of all of the things that happen, when you start transitioning out. And so when I really, when my PTSD was bad, when I sort of hit a mental health crisis in conjunction with a lot of other things, in working through that and out of that, I learned a lot of things. And one of the things I learned is that transition process wasn't great. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There are so many other folks who are still coming behind us that they have no idea of the struggles that lie ahead. You know what I mean? And I think in fairness, that's not exclusive to veterans, right? That's, you know what I mean? As you get older as a man, I think, once you've been married 10, 15 years, you have a little bit more authority to speak to someone who's a newlywed, right? You have, you're like, hey, these are probably some of the problems you're going to face, or as a dad, right? Which is probably more appropriate for this podcast. As you screw up on the first couple, you get better on the back, you like to think you've learned some lessons along the way. So,
and you feel that you're almost put into a mentorship position, where I've had this, I'm you get to a certain age, middle-aged people call it, I work in a high school, kids think I'm ancient. I'm only 42 years old. And I think that's still young. But I see young adults, mid-20s, stepping into a career that, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and they don't know what. And I feel that you're called to mentor to them. I see young men that I coach in basketball, and I feel that I'm called to mentor them. And so I can relate to what you're saying about seeing these others who are embarking on a path, and you feel that at this point, say, hey, listen, like now you're on this path, but when this path shifts and you step out of what you're doing now, this is what you need to be prepared for. Uh, do you mind
I
diving
liken
into
that.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I liken that to almost like there's a storm coming, right? And they're almost
Okay.
oblivious to it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Especially, I spent a lot of time training first responders as well. So
Mm-hmm.
folks who've been exposed to trauma, folks who typically haven't been prepared well, or haven't had the luxury of even had time to work through some of those problems. You know what I mean? So what tends to happen is, in the go spirit of things, or in the spirit of what's the next job, what's the next mission, you don't work through those traumas. You know what I mean? You just sort of put a lot of skeletons in a lot of closets. And I think because you feel like you're thriving, or because you're busy, I think what you don't realize is that at some point in your life, you're gonna have to clean those closets out. At some point, those skeletons come knocking. So I think it's more that perspective of, hey, like, I don't think and there's some, you're a little naive in that, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But sort of wanting to give them the tools to be able to handle the problems before the problems arise, if that makes sense.
Right. And you've faced a lot of intense situations in your career, right? That there's no doubt about that. There's no one listening to this who doesn't believe that Bill went through some very intense in situations. But it sounds like the transition out of those intense situations to the next stage of your life presented you with, a lot of roadblocks or speed bumps along the way. You talk about PTSD and dealing with trauma. And I'm not a trauma expert, but I know there's a lot of people out there right now who could be listening who are dealing with trauma in one way or another. And I'd love just to ask your perspective on, coming out of that and going through that as a man who, one, at home feels like he needs to be the leader, needs to be most of the time, like, I need to have my stuff in control. Like, I cannot appear weak. There's that manly macho part of it too, where it's like, I can't be this person. Like, I've gone through some things, different trauma, very different trauma than you've experienced. But when we work with that, it's really hard to let that through and work through that. So yeah, would you mind sharing what that looks like, and speak to anybody who you feel that, might be listening to this?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think societally, right, there's an expectation on the male, or if you're the head of the household, or if you're the leader, right, the servant leader of your family. And I think heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? And I think there's some things that go along with that. And I think we put these sort of expectations on ourselves that at times are very unrealistic, right? There's that I'm the IT expert of this house. I have zero qualifications to be the IT expert of this home, right? I get on YouTube, or I Google something, and I just do the best I can. And to them, it doesn't appear that way, right? I'm just, you know what I mean? Like, and I think as men, we're wired to be problem solvers. And sometimes that's why we struggle to communicate with our spouses, and our kids for that matter, because sometimes they're not looking for their problems to be solved. But I think that we sort of put this expectation on one another and on ourselves that we're supposed to have all the answers all the time. And I talk with men all the time who, nobody ever taught them how to change a tire. I'd like to think my dad taught me how to change a tire, but really it was just hold a flashlight and curse at me. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of teaching happening per se in those moments, right? So I think the first thing we all collectively have to kind of have a conversation about is, it's number one, it's okay to not be okay. Mm-hmm. And number two, we don't expect anyone in our lives to have all the answers. We don't expect our kids or our spouses to have it all figured out. And we expect them to let us know when they're struggling or when they're having difficulties. Yet we don't apply that same template to ourselves. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? We just assume that if we admitted to them that we were struggling with some things, that they would view that as a weakness. And I think in general, as I've grown and as I've done more men's work, my perspective on what I view as a powerful man has changed significantly.
Yeah.
Right. It's not the biggest guy and
Yeah.
it's not the loudest guy. It's typically it's the most vulnerable guy, the guy who's willing to be most vulnerable and most honest and most forthcoming about who he is and where he is in relation to what's going on, tends to be the most powerful guy in my eyes. In the SEAL teams, you'd see it. We're constantly being exposed to weapons. We're constantly being exposed to, and there's this sort of expectation there too, that you're supposed to be an expert in all these things. Right. And the humble warrior is the guy that says, hey man, could you take 10 seconds and just show me how this weapon platform works?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've never worked on this before. I've never shot a Russian disc or a, whatever this is. And the less vulnerable guys or the less transparent guys just pretend that they know what they're doing, right? Just that fake it till you make it perspective that most of us sort of, apply because we're afraid we'll be judged for not knowing. And the minute somebody does that, they almost endear themselves to you. You're like, hey, that guy was humble enough to just tell me he didn't know. And I'm like, you know what? I'm really glad you asked that question because to be honest, I don't know much about that weapon platform either, or I don't know how to change brakes on a Volkswagen Jetta either. But let's find somebody who can teach us both. And I think it's just being more honest, right? And not you can be Superman, I think, to your family in other ways,
right?
And you don't have to necessarily have it all figured out,
right? And there's a lot of messaging right now about this hyper masculinity and bravado of having it all figured out and being the guy who's got it all. And I love to see also that right now there's this kind of uprising in messaging, like you just shared, that when you walk into a room, the biggest, loudest personality in the room isn't always the most confident, most secured, most structured personality in the room. I've realized this walking into some big rooms with lots of very successful, influential, very heart-driven people. And I always can pick out the quiet one. And I'm like, I always wonder, like, what are they thinking right now? And the one who speaks last, and the one that when they speak, everybody's like, oh, okay, yeah, there you are, right?
And they speak quietly and in control, and they make you lean in.
Yeah.
The other one, when they speak, everybody grabs their pen and starts writing. Yeah.
Exactly. And in the home, I think that's a powerful tool to use in the home. Slow to react, calm to speak. Yeah.
And for me, especially with my kids, I finally got to the point where it's not even calmly speaking. I'm trying to speak less. You know what I mean? Like I'm just so the famous thing is how many times do I have to tell you? If I had a dollar for every time my parents told me that, or I've used that on my kids, and there's no answer to that question. Like clearly telling them over and over again is not the way. And so I just finally getting to that place where it doesn't matter what I tell them. It only matters what I'm demonstrating. It only matters what, my wife and I are demonstrating to them. Like they imitate what they see, not do as I say thing. It doesn't work well.
Absolutely. You spoke a bit to, men being able to just make that connection, right? To be authentic. You gave the example of, that guy who asks for help when he needs it. And I know you're passionate about helping men connect in a way that's authentic and meaningful, not in a way that is based on, bravado and look at me and look how much money I've made and what I've experienced. And I'll be honest, Bill, there's other guys who've had, combat experience, Navy experience, worked in situations like you did, who would come onto a podcast and would be raw. That's all they wanted to, like, they're still working through that lens, right?
Yeah. I agree. And I think, I think it's like the adage of the old guys who get together and all they talk about is their old glory days of high school football.
Yeah.
I mean, when I get together with guys I serve with, obviously there's a kinship and a connection there. But if all we're ever going to talk about is stuff we did 15 years ago, you know what I mean? And I think a lot of that is born and bred in the fact that they have not found another tribe, or they haven't connected to something bigger than themselves. And that's really what they've lost. That's why I think a lot of us are struggling, right? Because you haven't transitioned to, you need to be a servant leader. And I think you need to find your purpose. You need to find a new purpose. And the one nicety about being in the military is our purposes combined, and it's easy to show up when somebody tells you what color socks to wear and what the next mission is.
Mhm.
Now that you're on your own, you got to go find your own mission, right?
Mhm.
It's on me. It's incumbent on me to sort of, I'm the mission commander now, as opposed to just following orders. Okay, this is what we're doing next. So, I think that loss of connection for a lot of us is significant.
Yeah.
You know,
This,
it's the running back who can no longer be in the NFL. It's the same journey, right? Like so much of your identity is tied up in what you do that when you're not able to do that anymore, you don't know who you are. I know
yeah.
for me, that was precisely when the house of cards came tumbling down for me, I didn't know who I was. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. I was 10 years removed from service, and any of the healthy habits that I had from the military were gone. The only things I had were the bad habits. I didn't recognize who I was. I'm like, hey, I equate it to land navigation, right? I'm looking at the map and I don't know where north is. I don't know where I am on the map. I can't orient. I don't, you know, and now all my decisions moving forward are sort of skewed because I don't even, I'm off track. If that makes sense.
Right. You've mentioned some terms on here that we've heard, guys listen to this may have heard from other guests in the past. You mentioned the word tethered, being tethered to something that's going to pull you along, having direction, being pulled by somebody else who's going to have more or less have your back, right? Accountability and community. And I know that you're passionate about teaching, you have a depth of experience, and you've taken that and you've started to create something really cool for men. So I want to dive into that. Let's talk about connection and men and your project that you have going right now.
Yeah, that I'd love to talk about that. That's it was kind of a twofold thing. We're doing we're running what we call man camps.
Mm-hmm.
And they're 4.5 days sort of immersive experiences where we get together as a group. We go out in the woods and we throw axes and we have campfires and we do some ceremonial things and we connect. There's something about being out in nature, right? That you connect to, you unplug and you disconnect from the phone and from
Absolutely.
where you're at, and you get plugged in with other guys. And I think the creation of the concept of it for me was when I was struggling and I was working through that, this is what I went in search of. Right. And I'm very thankful for my struggle, right? I'm thankful for the things I went through because it gave me an opportunity to do things I wouldn't have been qualified to have the conversations I'm having now with men, having not, I wouldn't empathize the same way if I hadn't had the anxiety or the panic attacks or so it kind of gives you an authority that you wouldn't have otherwise had. And more than anything, this is number one, my struggle led me back to faith, right? Led me to being grounded and getting baptized. And I'll be eternally thankful for that. Because without that strong foundation, everything else was sort of all over the place. Everything I built, and I'd use that analogy earlier about the house of cards tumbling because I didn't have a firm foundation underneath me. But one of the things the church couldn't give me was this, and that's kind of what I went, when I asked, and in doing a lot of work and seeking it out, I started realizing, hey, there's a significant issue with men's ministry. Men's ministry in most of these places is a pancake breakfast once a month. But there was tons of sort of her empowerment things going on. And I was like, hey, what about us? What about us? And
what was when you said that? What about us? What about us? What about the guys? What was the response that you got?
Well, we have a thing, and hey, we get together the third Thursday of the month at IHOP, and I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. But I knew I was suffering from soul wounds, and I knew what I needed, and it wasn't that. And that also corresponded with the isolation of COVID, right? So all of us, I think collectively, were really longing for fellowship in person, not via Zoom, not, you know what I mean? So I think that was compounding on top of all the other things. And I knew that God had put it on my heart to go, hey, you were looking for this. It didn't exist. The onus is on you to create this. And if this is what you need because you feel like you're wounded or you're struggling, you're not alone in that. So go and create it. And I pitched it to a couple of other veteran friends, guys I've known for a long time that were having similar struggles. And, they were like, yeah, absolutely. When can we go? you
Yeah.
know, and we did 4 of them last year, and initially it was going to be like sort of proof of concept. And what we realized quickly is, wow, like men in general, it wasn't just veterans, and it wasn't just middle-aged men, because we've had young guys, single guys, older guys, men in general, I think are just, I think it's never been a more difficult time to be a man than there is today in society. I think the things we're being told, the stuff that we're seeing in television and movies, the accusations of mansplaining things and toxic masculinity and all this, I just think men are really hurting. I know our suicide rates are through the roofs, our abuse of alcohol and opioids and things like that are through the roof. I just think in general, men are suffering.
Agreed.
And I think, you and I are both in a mastermind together. And one of the things that really endeared me to that mastermind, not only was I looking for fellowship, I was looking for an older adult male role model to pattern for me what being a good man looked like. And I didn't realize how important that was.
Right.
And I didn't realize that nobody was serving that role in my life.
That's interesting. I think about why I joined. I think it's the same. I do. And we are both equally yoked in the fact that, we have a faith that drives us, but we have similarities as well. And I love listening to you speak, because we have similarities about helping men by meeting them where they're at, not telling them, not shooting on them, like bringing them along a journey, letting them discover for themselves where they want to be and what they need to be, and to be there to scaffold that journey for them. And I love that you use nature, because nature is a place that my family and I get grounded. And I will say to my wife, Kim, I need to go for a day. I need to go to, we have a place nearby, Waterton National Park. I need to go climb Bertha Peak. I need to go do something by myself. I need to go ski for a day. I need to do something, I love that you use nature for that. I'm curious, with these camps that you've run, personality wise, I would come into the camp kind of eager, but I think I'd be a little bit more withdrawn, and then something would happen that would just make me want to dive right in. What do you see from guys when they show up to man camp? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's been interesting, because I'm intentional about not really laying out all of what's going to happen. You know what I mean? I want there to be a little ambiguity there, and I want them to be curious, but I also want to set the stage that, hey, we're not just getting together to drink beer and throw axes. Like, you're coming here because we're going to move dirt and we're going to do some work, right? The expectation is for you to man up. I want you to go home a better man, right? For yourself and for whoever else you owe it to. And I knew, my suspicion was that other men were hurting, and that if I could create the right space, they would come out of their shell and they would share to some extent. That was, and I felt like God was saying, hey, that's exactly right. Just go do it. And it took me a little longer to put it into place. And so when I got home from the first one, my wife said, how did it go and how do you feel? I said, first off, it felt good to be obedient, right? Like I knew I was supposed to have done this, and I was probably wrong for not just acting on it. I kind of did what I typically do, which is then run it through a sounding board and a committee and run 8 other guys. I need to hear it confirmed back 6 times. And for me, familiar. And for me that, now looking back, like, hey, that's just not having enough faith, right? That's the definition of faith. But yeah. I knew my suspicions were right, or I knew God was correct. I knew things were right when literally in the first night, guys set up their tents. We walked up to where we were going to have dinner. And all they were supposed to do was go around in the circle and introduce themselves and just do a quick 30-second bio. Yeah. And halfway through the circle, guys were starting to share at levels that were,
and you're like, hold up, that's not till tomorrow.
Yeah. I was like, whoa, save some for the sequel. I pumped the brakes. I'm like, this wasn't in the script, and all we had done prior to that was all we had done is put the left and right lateral limits up. We had just made it a safe space. We had just said, hey, one, if you're open to the fact that things can be different, right, then you're winning the mind and you're right? Whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. And we had just said, listen, whatever happens here is going to stay here. Okay. And what if this is just a weekend where you put away the macho stuff and you stop worrying about how people are judging you, and you just let people around you for once see the real version of you, the things that you don't show your coworkers or your teammates, or and if you do that and trust in the process, I promise what you'll get out of it on the back end will be, you'll struggle to put into words. And like I said, I think we did a really good job, the team that I put together, of creating that safe space. And there's enough guys now that I can't talk to a guy or meet a guy that's been through the experience that doesn't want to talk more about it.
Yeah. And I didn't want to interrupt you, but as soon as you said safe space, you probably saw me. It's like, yes, because I think it's important for men to have a safe space where they can open up to each other, but not confusing a safe space for an easy space. Because sometimes, like, this is a safe space. Oh, good. This will be a cakewalk. No, but this is a safe space where we're going to dig in. We're going to do the work, and we're going to get you to where, on track to where you need to be. No, I appreciate that. And I'm not going to get you to expand like how you create this safe space, because that's your thing. And I love it. I just think it's great.
Yeah. And we've got some really clever ways and things and exercises that we do. And it's almost like sleight of hand, it's kind of the guys look back now and they're like, wow, I didn't even realize until we were knee deep in it what we were doing, like we just have them, do some journaling, and we have them, hey, write down what you think were some impactful moments in your life or whatever. And then later on, they end up presenting those things to the group, and they don't realize how retrospective they've been acting, and they don't realize how reflective, and they don't realize that, they're finally making time for themselves to think about who they are and why they are, and start wrestling with some of those things, and then start sharing them. And, if I had, almost every single guy at some point during that weekend says, I've never told anyone this, and that's when breakthroughs are coming. That's when this guy's going to go home a lot lighter than he came. This guy's
who's man camp for? Like, who's man camp for? And there's sometimes I might ask you, who's it for? Who's it not for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's been a little bit of the struggle, frankly, from the marketing perspective, right? Because if you're listening to the marketing geniuses and you listen to the, what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to niche down, right? And I think initially I thought it was going to be veterans, because that's, obviously that's the language I speak, and that's the community that I have the most access to, and I have credibility there. But because things were sort of in a COVID lockdown, it was just my friends and family in the beginning. It was guys that I knew and had a connection to. And then those guys were impacted and came back and brought somebody that was important to them. And so it's a tough question to answer. I think if you're a man and you're struggling in any way, shape, or form, it's absolutely for you. But we've had guys come through that I think if you'd have asked them if they were struggling, they would have said no. And then when they left, they realized,
oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, because I think, the other thing I think is when we look at successful, whatever our definition is of success, we look at successful people, right? Whether it's wealth, or whether it's success on the family front, or whether it's, we tell ourselves a story that they're absolved of any of the problems that we have day to day. Yeah. And I think for most of us, I always think of it as juggling balls. Like if you're doing well at work or you're doing well with the family, there's other balls that are in the air that you don't have your hands on. Right. And I think it's always just managing it the best you can. Right. And you always feel like you're struggling in one of those areas. Like, maybe things with your wife are great, but financially things are not good. Or, hey, we've got debt, or, hey, my relationship with my oldest son could be better, or whatever that is. So it's a tough question to answer for who it's for. Because honestly, we've had guys from all walks of life come through and they were impacted. Now they're impacted at different levels. But I think moving forward, initially, I think we're probably going to niche a little more toward the veterans. And when I say veterans, not exclusively military veterans, probably military and first responder veterans, because there's a lot of similarity there, right? That sort of being in service and, typically being exposed to a lot of traumatizing events, right? You kind of, the veil, you see behind the curtain, and you get to see sort of the worst of what society has to offer on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. And you're familiar with the fact that people want to end your life on a day-to-day basis. And that it sort of puts you in a little bit of a different perspective.
That's intense. Yeah, that's intense. When that's your filter, the people want to end your life on a day-to-day basis. Yeah,
And that skews you, right? That skews
Yeah.
you from how you interact with the rest of the world. And you can't treat people that way. And you can't, you our brains and our minds are designed to keep us alive and keep us safe.
Mm-hmm.
And overriding that mechanism is a difficult thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you see some things and you experience some things like that, you go into, I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep myself safe, right?
Yeah.
And avoid certain situations and circumstances that make me uncomfortable. And the problem is, a lot of those situations and circumstances are not avoidable, right?
Yeah. Right.
Social settings, and they're things that frankly are good and healthy things. You just don't have the coping skills, or you haven't worked through your stuff yet to be able to put yourself in those situations.
Yeah. Interesting. And speaking of situations that, push you to be uncomfortable a little bit and improve maybe in areas that are of attention to you. What's one area right now that, you, as you're embarking on a new mission, are excited about growing in, or an area that you're focused on right now?
Yeah, I think for me, it's I've bounced around doing a bunch of different things, trying to figure out what this next chapter of my life would look
Mm-hmm.
like. And I think it's being honest with myself. Like I want to do this entrepreneurial thing, and I want to kind of build something, and like having the honest conversation of what is my true zone of excellence? What are the gifts? What are the talents that God has given me? And what am I good at? I'm good at serving. I'm good at leading these things. I'm good at creating this space and running the camp. Maybe I'm not necessarily good at building a business, right? Maybe I'm not necessarily good at business strategy. And, so for me, the struggle is the willingness to give up all of those things and go search for someone who can sort of help us with the things that we're not good at, right? So just being honest, right? And just having that conversation with myself of, hey, like, that's not my strong suit. I don't have a business degree. I don't, and I think a younger version of me would have taken that more as a challenge. Like, well, I don't know that, so I'm going to go learn it. I'm going to get good at it. And I think I did that I helped start a nonprofit that I'm still loosely involved with. And all of that was a great, I tell people all the time, that was sort of like my MBA, right? That's how I learned. And what I learned is, I have no idea how to produce a podcast. Cool. I'm going to learn that. And once I learned it, you know what I learned? I don't like producing podcasts. It's not what I want to do. I'm going to learn how to edit a podcast. I don't like editing podcasts. You know what I mean? So I think now being more honest with myself and saying, if I want to do this, I'm going to have to give up something else. What am I willing to give up? Right? Is it at the cost of time with my family? Is it at the cost of something else? And am I best suited for that? Or can I just, outsource that to someone else, or find my who, right? Not my how. Find somebody else who's passionate about helping men, and that's their zone of excellence.
Yeah. Awesome. Bill, I appreciate you coming on here and sharing a bit of your story and what you're working on right now. If someone wants to connect with you, wants to hear more about and learn more about the Man Camp and what you've got going, where can they do that?
First off, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to share it. We were under the guise of the Man Up Project, and we're now kind of going through a rebranding and a relogoing and all of what goes with that. And now it's because there's a book already and somebody else is already sort of in that space. And again, good lesson learned, right? Do your due diligence before you just launch a website, right? But now we're the Turn 2 Project, or turn2project.com, and 2 is TO. And that term is a Navy term. They'll kind of indicate it by turning to, not a double play in baseball, but it means get to work, right? So as a young sailor, you hear that a lot, like, hey, turn 2, let's go. If you're loafing and oafing off, and the reason we chose that term is the other sort of spin on the word. Our philosophy when it comes to helping or growing is we want you to believe that life is happening for you and not to you. Right. So turning the 2 to 4, right? That turning 2, right? Because if you want to stay in that victim mindset, it's tough to grow, and it's tough to be a better dad or a better husband or a better anything. right? If you believe you're the victim, and I think that's what society expects of us, and society rewards us for being the victim. And if, there's some value in being the victim. If you're the victim, you get to always be right, but it doesn't generally come with growth, and it doesn't generally come with all the other things that I think we're seeking, as men.
Yeah. Excellent. We'll make sure that the Turn 2 project is listed down in the show notes and people can get in contact with you. Bill, thanks again for taking time. Gonna have to have you on in the future again on another episode to dive more into the conversation, how to support men, but I appreciate you, brother.
Man, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for what you're doing. And for all the dads out there, man, you are a dad that's making a difference.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.